Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Carl Block. Carl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show.
I want to shift gears for a second, and I want to talk about conflicts that are going around in the world, maybe will soon be going around in the world and expanding. And in particular, I want to talk about how these conflicts are going to affect businesses, which obviously, which if they affect businesses, most of the time they're also going to affect the consumer. And so first, I want to talk about the Ukraine war. My understanding is they're a big grain exporter. They have historically exported natural gas, and they have precious minerals. If that war were to go on, or if for a really prolonged period of time, or they were not to prevail, what do you see the effect on U.S. and other businesses as a result of maybe the things that they do export maybe not being available or being less available?
I think that the biggest challenge that we have is to clearly identify what is our strategic objective for the United States in this region. We don't talk about it. We talk about Ukraine as if it's an island almost, as opposed to being a part of Eastern Europe on the Black Sea, and in a strategically important part of the world. And so because we haven't clearly identified an objective, it's difficult to have good policy. You can't have good policy if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish. And so the administration has to make the case to explain why what's happening in Ukraine affects people that live in Missouri or California or Michigan or Massachusetts. And it is about our economy. America's biggest trading partner, according to the Commerce Department, is Europe. The trade relationship between America and Europe is bigger than anything else. And so disruptions to grain supplies affects food prices around the world, not to mention the fact it affects the ability of people in Africa and the Middle East to eat. So that this is a significant disruption, and the disruption of energy flows and rare earth materials, as you've already described, affects us. It affects our economy. And of course, if our biggest trade relationship is with Europe, then we need Europe to be prosperous. Our prosperity is connected to Europe's prosperity. And it's very difficult for Europe to be prosperous when they don't have uninterrupted energy supplies, when they've got millions of Ukrainian refugees that are now in Germany, Poland, Romania, and other places. And if Ukraine fails in this conflict, then the number of refugees is going to surge as they try to move away from the conflict area. So this is a real problem for the United States, for our economic prosperity. And then, of course, does the United States have the political will and the industrial capacity and the military capability to enforce or defend the so-called international rules-based order, respect for sovereignty, respect for international law, respect for human rights, freedom of navigation? That's what's at stake in this conflict in Ukraine now. If we can't defend successfully those values in Europe, it will be much more difficult to do it in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think potential adversaries out there will not be real impressed when we talk about South China Sea or the Philippines.
Okay. And I want to get back to Europe for a second and then ask you more about the Indo-Pacific area. So obviously, if there are energy disruptions and Europe goes into hardship, we're not going to really get them. We're not going to really be able to export a lot to them. I suppose also the global price of energy is going to go up for all of us. I mean, this is basic supply and demand, where if you take a certain amount of energy off the market, global prices are going to go up, which could have an inflationary effect there too. And with respect to these minerals, aren't those a lot of minerals that are used to help make batteries and electric cars and a whole other parts of industry?
Yeah, Ukraine sits because of a zillion years of the life of the planet and the way water flows. This is a place that is rich with important minerals. And so there's a reason that there's been so many wars in that area as well as people fighting over that. It's the reason Catherine the Great annexed Crimea back at the end of the 18th century, was to be able to dominate the Black Sea, which was a major east-west as well as north-south uh, avenue for commerce. So this is a strategically important area. I think that the West has to decide, um, are we willing to do what it takes to defend that area, to defend sovereignty, and to ensure freedom of navigation or not? If we're not, then we're going to end up in endless wars. I think this conflict now in Ukraine is what failed deterrence looks like.
So let's talk about another hotspot, the Middle East. We've seen that there have been tremendous disruptions to shipping as a result of the actions of one of the actors in the area. And you would know better than I would the amount of resources that we're trying to throw into trying to reestablish shipping through the Middle East and the effect that it will have on global commerce. What are your thoughts on what will happen to economies as it is harder to move to move move product, minerals, supplies through the Red Sea or other oceans over there?
Well, um, first of all, we have to decide that this is a priority. Um, and I've seen two or three things lately that raise my concern. I'm sure many of our listeners will have seen that two very large cargo ships carrying hundreds of the containers just started moving north from China to begin passage through the Arctic to get around to Europe because they see that going through the Red Sea is no longer safe enough to do that. And so, as the Arctic changes due to climate change, there's no denying that that's changing. You could argue about the causes, but there's no denying that it's changing. And so, as more and more ships began to use that northern route, that shows the strategic significance of our inability to ensure freedom of navigation through the Red Sea. So that businesses will start looking for alternative routes, and who controls those routes? That is a strategic problem for us. The second thing was I started looking at what have we been doing lately against the Houthis. And the latest tally, unclassified, that I saw were 17, just in the last week, 17 different uh, drones or missiles were destroyed by U.S. forces that were Houthi drones that were getting ready to launch or had already been launched. And so 17 had been shot down or destroyed by us. Now, of course, what we don't know is how many, what percentage is that of what they have. I think it's probably a very, very small percentage. And being able to knock down occasional drones is not guaranteeing freedom of navigation. It helps, but we have got to find a way to solve the problem of the Houthis.
And I want to get back to the thing that you said about the climate and the northern routes. And by the way, very well said. I think that a lot of people don't visualize that with adverse weather conditions, you could have ships that are forced back to port. They could be sunk in seas. All of that causes a maritime insurance issue, shipping delays, instability. I mean, it's not a matter of something that you cure with solar panels or something. These are true weather disruptions that could be happening. which again, all that's going to do is cause increased pressures on any goods that would otherwise be going through the Red Sea and out into the Pacific.
Yeah, this is I was an infantry soldier, so ocean-going commercial shipping is not something I grew up understanding. But as I got older, I recognized that logistics was actually the most important thing for me to on which I had to focus. We could never assume that we would be able to move things back and forth across the Atlantic uncontested. And now, as we look at this northern route, these two Chinese merchant ships that I just mentioned, here it is in the month of July, and they still have to follow a nuclear-powered Russian icebreaker. So it'll probably get a little bit better in August, but this is a very short window when you don't need that kind of support. And so if the big ships are not able to go through the Red Sea, then they start having to rely more on the northern route. And so as we look at the world, we the West, how much do you want transportation infrastructure and transportation routes being dependent on the goodwill of other countries?
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
When you mentioned logistics, and I'm sure you were a bit of a war historian. I mean, I think back to prior wars, in fact, World War II. We didn't necessarily have the best equipment. We may have had great soldiers, but without petroleum products or without spare parts and a number of things, we would have lost our competitive advantage that the other side didn't have. And it may have made a heck of a difference. And certainly from a civilian context, anytime you have scarcities, anytime you have disruptions, all prices go up. And that makes it harder on the middle class and a lot of other people to survive. So I'm there with you. We had obviously there's been very recently, in the past 24 hours, a couple of significant military events in the Middle East. And I'm guessing, if a larger war breaks out, there's going to be even more energy disruption, less ability to ship through the area, and probably a lot of diversion of resources that are going to affect modern economies too.
So I think the United States strategy or strategic approach to the Middle East for decades has been largely driven by trying to ensure access to and delivery of oil and gas that we all needed. And so even though the United States now is a net exporter, disruptions to that in the Middle East affects most of our allies and our customers. And so that's always going to be a part of it. I think that the situation we have now is bad for business, and it's also bad for democracy. This is a very, very difficult situation.
All right, so let's turn to Asia Pacific. We talked about Indo-Pacific a little bit before. I think that, well, most people don't think about it this way. We've been a maritime power in the United States for quite a while. Of course, there was Britain before that, but we are a significant maritime power, and we want to be able to export and import from every ocean that there is. And, if there is a conflict that breaks out there, whether it's with any of the islands, any territories, any duly constituted land-based countries, we could have a risk about any commercial shipping getting in there and out of there. Isn't that right?
So you are correct that the United States is a maritime nation. And I don't mind saying that. Even as a U.S. Army infantry soldier, we are a maritime nation. And as my Navy buddies always remind me, that in the Constitution, in our Article 1 of the Constitution, which lays out the responsibilities of the Congress, it specifically says the Congress shall maintain a Navy and provide an Army as needed. So even back then, they knew that we had to have a Navy, and thank goodness we do have a great Navy and Navy tradition. But even our Navy today is stretched way beyond their resources to be able to do what we ask of it to do. It's incredible how much. And of course, American shipbuilding is not at the capacity that it used to be. Or even the maintenance. My Navy friends complain about how long it takes to get certain things repaired, basic repairs. I was in Norfolk just the other day, and you look out there and you see all these ships there in their home port at Hampton Roads, and it's incredible power, but it's very expensive. And to do the maintenance and to have enough sailors that are trained to do what needs to be done, that has to be a priority for our government. Otherwise, there is no freedom of navigation. I mean, there's nobody else in the world that has the capability and the reach to ensure freedom of navigation. And people are not going to obey international law, especially at sea, unless they're forced to. And that's why our Navy does what it does out in the Indo-Pacific region, sailing through areas that are contested.
Okay. So, and then the last one I want to talk about before we talk about some really cool stuff about trends. There was recently an election in Venezuela. You have one side saying that they did win lawfully, and another side saying that they didn't. And as of today, this has not been resolved. There hasn't been a solution. If there becomes more instability there, do you see potential issues way beyond one that I think you mentioned the other day, loss of refugees, which in and of itself is incredibly disruptive? But I believe the existing government there has laid claims to an oil reserve in a neighboring country. Do you see them potentially getting more aggressive and creating a distraction while they try to consolidate their existing power? Do you think, there's going to be a risk? Because my recollection is within the past year, they did actually mass troops, against their neighbors. Do you think we're going to see something like that again?
Well, certainly, Carl, that's a possibility that I would not rule out. But I'm not sure if the Maduro government is completely confident in the reliability of their own armed forces.
Mm-hmm.
And could they afford to divert forces, even if they are reliably loyal, to divert them away from protecting the government from what appears to be enormous crowds and demonstrations of Venezuelans who are not happy with the Maduro government claiming a victory when almost nobody else on the planet truly believes that he won. I mean, Venezuela's numbers, their leaders are saying, come on, this is not legitimate. So I don't know that they would, in fact, attack a neighbor to distract unless they were completely confident that they had adequate security forces that could deal with these demonstrations that could, especially if they were sparked by the death of a young person or something that really motivated people to take on the government. And I think any authoritarian governments have to be concerned when they see crowds like this toppling statues. This morning I saw the third statue of Chavez being pulled over, posters of Maduro being torn down. I mean, these are brazen acts of resistance. So I don't know where this is going to go yet, but if the government does crack down, then for sure we will see more Venezuelan refugees probably heading north, joining the several millions of others who have already left the country.
Okay. All right. So listen, I think that's a great sort of recap of where we are. So let's talk about trends, and let's talk about defense and civilian construction now. As a result of all this stuff going on, first let me just ask you. My understanding is that a lot of the munitions, the low tech munitions that we have historically made in this country, we're not making very much of, and those seem to be useful in a number of battlefronts. Do you see us ramping up some more of that industrial production, especially artillery shells or other things like that?
Yeah, we 2 years ago were producing about, I think it was 7 or 8,000 rounds per month of 155 millimeter artillery ammunition. And that number was based on our own requirements for training. That's how much we would expend per month across the U.S. military for training. And so you maintain a certain basic stockage, and then you expend each month a certain amount. The Department of Defense has already quadrupled that number based on requirements from on what we're seeing in Ukraine, the need to restock what we gave to Ukraine, and other countries are obviously producing additional ammunition as well. We we made the classic mistake of thinking we'll never need this again, and so you stop. And of course, in defense industry, these are not charities. They have huge numbers of employees. They have unique supply chains, and this is not a product that you make and put in a store and hope somebody comes by and buys it. You make it in response to a demand that you're pretty certain is going to be there for a while. And so this is where political will really comes in. And I think the government, our government, and others are recognizing that a big part of deterrence, effective deterrence, is demonstrating that you also have the stuff. It's not just about how many tanks or F-35s or whatever you have. Do you already also have the logistics, the ammunition, the fuel, the repair parts needed to make that force effective? So I do see continued increases in this. And I just read an article yesterday about a company in UK is restarting production of the barrel for howitzers. People thought, oh, all you need is drones. That's just not the case.
Understood. So in our country, to get up to the optimal level of production of the ammunition, is this a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year type situation? What do you think it would take?
Well, not to be flip about it, but it depends on how much money you're willing to put on it, and how certain will industry be that this won't be turned off in 2 years.
Fair
I mean, if you want to, I've been out to the ammunition plant in McAlester, Oklahoma. This is pretty complex stuff. They're not making hubcaps, and so if you want to double production out there, it's a pretty sophisticated production line. And also, the people that do this, these are people that there's certain skills. Not summer interns. I was at the plant. I was at the General Dynamics plant several years ago in Lima, Ohio, where they make the Abrams tank, the best tank in the world. It's incredible. But I would say that most of the men and women who were working there were probably in their late 40s, early 50s. In other words, they have been making tanks for a long time, and you can't just replace that workforce. There's a training requirement, and that obviously takes time. And all of them, whether you're talking about helicopters or F-35s or submarines or tanks or ammunition, they need components that come from all over the country, and in some cases other parts of the world, particularly for explosives, for example. And these are not guaranteed supply chains. So there has to be confidence in industry that the government is going in for the long haul, before a company would take a huge risk like that. Now, I do think the industry has a responsibility to accept some of the risk as well.
Understood. So also, I want to talk about something you touched upon. You did it mostly from the military aspect, but shipping. So we are not only the maritime power that can safeguard the seas, but we obviously export, and we need to ensure that we're not dependent upon anybody else for the ability to ship our goods wherever they may be. Do you see that it would be viable here to actually ramp up our commercial shipping production here, or are we more likely to rely on allies like South Korea or other countries with very good shipyards to help us there? What are your thoughts there?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I don't know that it's feasible now for the U.S. to rely only on U.S. manufactured shipping. I mean, that I guess you could, but I don't know that that would be sustainable over the long haul. And of course, we want allies that have capabilities as well. But I was I was in Hamburg, Germany, a few weeks ago to give a presentation, and I was hosted by a very well-known shipping company that's based there. And somebody pointed out to me that over 50% of the commercial shipping in the world is manufactured by China. Now, all of us use Chinese product, but is that what we want? Is to for one country to control over 50% of the construction of new ships, and of course, most of the major seaports around the world, or many of them, use these cranes that are produced by China for obvious reasons. They're very good, but are there vulnerabilities in these cranes that we should be taking into account? So I think you have to make smart economic decisions, but those are not divorced from security concerns. And do we create vulnerabilities by dependence on others? I think the United States, if we want to retain the ability to control the maritime domain, we need to make sure we're producing everything as much as we can that is sustainable from an economic standpoint.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to talk to you about new technologies now. A couple of weeks ago, we had on our friend Neil Keegan from Marlinspike, who is investing in a lot of these dual-use things. What kinds of new technologies do you think are going to have military applications, but also dual use? And it's really to your point. If we're only producing stuff that has only a military application, what if the country doesn't have the will to produce them? And so I could see how, as Neil would say, and I think you would say, dual use viability is critical to the investments in this technology and the production.
Yeah, I think developments in communications and in transportation and decision making, these are capabilities. Night vision, these are capabilities that are useful not just in the military, but also law enforcement, industry, all sorts of commerce. The United States Navy today is putting millions of dollars of investment into what we call maritime unmanned system, Navy drones. We just had a vessel transit the Atlantic Ocean, a drone for the first time, I believe, or the first time I'm aware of. I mean, that's significant when you develop this potential to where you can transport cargo or capabilities without having to have a crew. I mean, that reduces the size, the weight, the requirements for protection significantly. And so you could imagine having lots of maritime drones that were each carrying cargo, and maybe they were tethered to one manned vessel that would expand significantly the ability to transport, whether it's the Atlantic or inside the Mediterranean or in the Pacific. That kind of capability is significant, and particularly for smaller nations that cannot afford the overhead of traditional manned ships, frigates, destroyers, etc. But to be able to still protect your coastline, protect your own shipping, those kinds of capabilities, or to move back and forth across the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea, unmanned systems, I think, is an area that has unlimited potential.
And for that matter, though, also undersea drones potentially, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that would be included in the family of maritime unmanned systems. We already use some of these things, but you've got so many undersea cables, for example. And if you're wanting to do maintenance or install new cables at big depth, having maritime unmanned systems that can do that much more safely than if you put somebody or a couple of technicians inside one of these deep water subs. I mean, that's obviously going to have real benefit. So I see great potential there. In terms of communications, how do you work in a multinational environment, not just in the military, but in a multinational environment where the more nations, the more companies, the more organizations that are involved, the more vulnerabilities and what we call attack surfaces are presented when you have to start bringing together. So if you've got the ability to conduct sensitive, multinational, international communications, which secure, can't be hacked or can't be jammed by whether it's an adversary or a competitor. I mean, those are real capabilities that are going to be worth. I mean, because look what happened with this cyber shutdown, the CrowdStrike. Yeah. I mean, look at the impact that had. So I think finding ways to protect our information technologies and making it work in an international environment is going to be essential for continued economic development. I think most people listening already know that, but every time something like CrowdStrike happens or pipelines get shut down because they were hacked somehow, and I think that's an area where you're always going to see potential for development. And then finally, in the medical field, we always unfortunately learn a lot from combat about how to treat casualties. So you're dealing with terrible trauma every single day, and so typically military medicine is ahead of the rest because of the necessity of having to deal with that. The only comparable thing would be big city, inner city hospitals where they deal with a lot of trauma. But investing in technologies that help with life-saving procedures, medicines, materials. I think we discovered during COVID that we were reliant on other countries to provide a lot of this kind of stuff. This is an area where I think there is potential, and there's always going to be a need for it. And then on the backside of it, physical therapy and also mental health, post-traumatic situations, post-conflict. This is not just soldiers that have to deal with this.
Understood. And I'll just briefly talk to you about AI. I assume that you're on top of the use of AI, both in the kinetic and the civilian application context.
So, artificial intelligence is, it's the word or the acronym gets tossed around all the time, but I think it has a lot of different meanings and applications. I think we've probably been using artificial intelligence for quite some time without calling it artificial intelligence. I think that the ability to capture the capabilities there to enable commanders to make decisions more quickly than an opponent, which is what every commander since Julius Caesar has always wanted, the ability to think faster and act faster than an opponent. When you can do that through your devices, of course, that depends on what you put in there. I remember that from my first Fortran class as a cadet in 1976. Garbage in, garbage out. But how do you capture the potential of artificial intelligence without removing human and ethical considerations? I participated in a workshop with a large, well-known European company that was working on aircraft that would be combat aircraft. And of course, that aircraft would be loaded with the latest of weapon systems and also artificial intelligence to help the pilot, because even the best pilot in the world would have to admit that a computer would make a decision 10,000 times faster than he or she ever could. But nations correctly are going to be concerned about weapons being launched because of a computer decision versus a human making the ethical consideration. So I think what impressed me about this company was the work they were trying to do to build into the software ethical considerations that would still enable launching of weapons or protective systems fast enough to accomplish the mission, but which would still be done in a way that a human would ethically have decided.
That's amazing. That's amazing. We live in an incredible world with some incredible minds. So listen, I am so grateful that you had time to visit with me today. And, I'm really appreciative of you being on the show. I think our viewers and listeners are going to love it. For those who are out there, the people who do watch and follow, if you have any questions for me, you can email them to me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. And also, if you want to email me questions for General Hodges, I will forward them on to him. He's very prolific, as you know, from having stayed with us for a little bit over an hour, and definitely not afraid to speak his mind. It's one of the great things about him. And Ben, I want to thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, Carl, you're really patient and a glutton for punishment to let me go on this long. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at carl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.